Hello. Look, I'm sorry everybody I'm not able to be with you tonight, but I hope all is well with all of you. And I think the past 4 years have flown by. The Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, it's a brilliant name in itself. It resonates around the world, continues to do so, and the support for its aims just keeps on growing. And I was proud to attend the UN headquarters in New York and have personally presented the head of the conference, Ambassador Elaine White Gomez of Costa Rica, with a letter of support for the aims of the treaty from Scotland's First Minister, which included the Walter Scott quote asking that should all have the will to do and the soul to dare. This was a major United Nations event and was packed with both international diplomats and a fantastic number of delegates from civic society. Indeed, it was hard to find standing room around the fringes of the hall. So as I saw that the UK delegation hadn't deigned to attend, I decided, as an act of non-violent civil disobedience, to occupy the UK ambassador's chair. The next section along from there is the delegation from Uganda, and I saw that the Ugandan ambassador was pointing at me and asking one of his team what was going on here, because as far as he was concerned, of course, the UK didn't have a delegation in attendance. His attaché told him that I was from Scotland and was supporting the treaty. The ambassador smiled and nodded to me and gave me a thumbs up, which was very pleasant. And as we all know, the vote on that day was 122 nations in favour, with 1 against and 1 abstention. And Scotland had made its position clear, and we'll all continue to do so. We're going forwards towards a nuclear weapons free world, which the TPNW is a major step in. So I thought it was a fantastic achievement. I congratulate everybody that was involved, and I congratulate all of you tonight for gathering together to commemorate this important anniversary. So all the very best, and I'll catch you all soon. Thank you.
What's going to happen now is that we're going to have a discussion following contributions from a panel of international activists. So I'm going to introduce them, and we're going to start with Janet Fenton, who is a Vice Chair of Scottish CND, a member of ICANN's International Steering Group, and of the acronym Institute for Disarmament and Diplomacy, and part of the core group of Secure Scotland. So Janet will just speak for 3 minutes, and then we will turn to David Hutchison, who is the chairperson of the Irish Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament and another internationalist. And then we will turn to Aisha Asakan, who is director of the Nuclear Ban US, and she's worked for Nonviolent Peace Force, the UN in South Sudan and New York, and is a Rotary Peace Fellow and the co-chair of the working group of conflict prevention, peacekeeping and peacemaking with the organisation Women of Colour Advancing Peace and Security. And then we will turn to Tillman Ruff, who has got up in the middle of the night specially for us, which is incredibly noble and kind of him, and is co-president of the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, Australian chair, co-founder of the Australian Committee and member of the ICANN International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. So it's a very strong international panel. Each will speak for 3 minutes, and then you as the audience can put questions in chat, and I'll then try to help them have a conversation with each other and perhaps picking up some of your questions. So I'm going to start with Janet. Janet, please.
Thanks very much, Lynn. It's good to see such a nice gathering of all sorts of people here. I mean, we have to always start by saying that nuclear weapons are inhumane and indiscriminate on a scale that's completely beyond comprehension. Their use could end life on Earth. It could end the nature of the planet itself. They're not fit for any purpose. And they were developed in secret by a tiny minority of men with no mandate. And we absolutely need to eliminate them. And I mean, I first became aware of that thanks to John Hersey's book on the impact of and the reality of what happened in Hiroshima. And I joined Youth CND here in Edinburgh at that time, which was a very long time ago. But today is a very special day. It's a special day for me. The 7th of July is a day that is really marked on my calendar. And I'm particularly happy this year to be welcoming people to my homeland, with many people here who were at the UN in New York on the 7th of July 2017. And these are people who have become a special kind of community and have become friends in a particular kind of way over many years of international face-to-face meetings, emails, virtual online meetings. We were doing that before the pandemic made that a norm. So it's a very special occasion. I'd just like to recap for those of you that weren't quite able to hear what Bill was saying, that I mean, he and I were both in the room when the treaty was passed, and the very somber situation at the United Nations erupted into this incredible roar of joy that went up from people all around the room. And Bill had earlier in the session actually taken the empty UK seat, and as a Scottish person, just to say that we in Scotland want the ban treaty, even if the UK government doesn't, and got a thumbs up from some of the other delegates. And he also mentioned that he had brought with him a special letter from the First Minister of Scotland supporting the work towards getting the treaty. So I'm very happy that we're together and celebrating the adoption of the treaty and a chance to consider the progress it's made in our shared efforts. But the upshot is that we've still got to eliminate nuclear weapons. My first involvement was as a Wilf woman from Scotland, and it was the international perspective that really inspired me, especially because at that time we were just beginning a debate in Scotland about what Scotland could look like if it chose to vote for independence. It was an opportunity to actually look at the country and think, what would we do? How would we do things if we were able to start from scratch and build a new country? And it certainly didn't include having nuclear weapons. And the humanitarian conferences that happened and during that time, and I also had meetings around that time with people in Ireland, and first got to know David, who's on the meeting tonight.
Janet, you've muted yourself. Janet, I'm sorry, you're muted.
When did I become muted? Sorry.
No,
have I been muted throughout?
No, certainly not. Just
okay, that's good. Okay. Well, I was just trying to give a little tribute to Austria, Brazil, Ireland, New Zealand, Mexico, and South Africa. And I'm glad that we've got representation at our meeting from most of those places, because it was those countries that really, really stood out in support for understanding that we needed to actually look at the humanitarian impact of these weapons rather than some kind of artificial politics around national borders. There was also a strong strand in Scottish disarmament campaigning that we could get rid of the UK's nuclear weapons, which are all in Scotland, if we got independence. But I didn't want to just get rid of nuclear weapons from Scotland. I wanted them out of the world. And that was another reason why working for the ban treaty was such a strong imperative. And so after the open-ended working group that we had that advised that we should go for, or advised the General Assembly of the United Nations that they should go for a conference to write a ban treaty. We worked very hard here in Scotland to try and ensure that there was a strong delegation from civil society that contributed to that process, and we did that, and it was a very, very worthwhile and valuable exercise, and educated everybody within that group. And we sent that delegation, and now we're at a particularly important stage. We've got the treaty. It was adopted 4 years ago. It entered into force at the beginning of this year, and the first meeting of states parties will be at the beginning of next year. And we really need to make sure that we pay our debt, or that the debt is paid. It may not be our debt, it may belong to other people, but the debt to the Hibaksha and to all of the people that have been affected by the tests and the experimentation and the lost opportunity costs. And that means working with our parliamentarians and keeping the conversations focused on the reality of what the weapons do and challenging the political rhetoric. And I think that's enough from me, because I'm so looking forward to hearing from some of the other people that are here tonight. So thank you.
Thank you, Janet. Thank you very much. And we'll move straight on to David Hutchison. Edgar, David, please.
Thank you, Lynn, and thank you, Janet, and everyone in Scottish CND for the invitation to join you and many other people from other parts of the world tonight. I'm delighted to be able to share this celebration of 4 years of the ban treaty with you all tonight. One of my first meetings with the Irish government representing Irish CND was back around 2008, and we raised the possibility of a new treaty which would ban nuclear weapons internationally. And at that stage, the head of disarmament in Dublin said to us, yeah, it's a nice idea, but it's not going to happen anytime soon, maybe 20 years down the line, maybe 30 years, and we have to keep working with the NPT in the meantime. And it's really exciting every time I think about that, to think that we did it a lot sooner than that. And the international effort that came together to a huge extent under the umbrella of ICANN was able to shift governments like Ireland, which were sympathetic but couldn't really see the roadmap ahead of them, and that we were able to lay out a roadmap so that countries like Ireland and others like South Africa, Brazil, and those that Janet already listed, who supported the original motion at the UN for the talks on the ban treaty, and that we achieved that 4 years ago. And then a few years after that, in 2012, a backbench member of Parliament in Dublin introduced a bill in Parliament which would have banned Irish investments in nuclear weapons companies. And at that time, again, we were told by the Department of Finance this time that, yeah, it's a nice idea, but, and yeah, it ties in with Irish foreign policy, but there isn't anything that we don't have an international framework that would allow us to say that, you know, this is Irish. Ireland has signed up to this, and so we can't do it until there's a new treaty. And the thing that I'm really excited about over the last week or so is that at last, because of the TPNW, because of the ban treaty, Ireland has started to divest from companies which support the nuclear weapons industry. Some of you in the UK may have seen an article in the Sunday Times a week ago, not this past Sunday, on the 27th of June, which documented the first divestments from nuclear weapons companies arising from Ireland's ratification of the TPNW. And it's so exciting to see that happening, and to see that the TPNW is having a real impact in terms of policies, not just in terms of laying out what we want to happen and laying out hopes and aspirations, but it's actually making a difference to what countries who have ratified it are doing. And what is even more interesting for me is that the Sunday Times isn't an Irish newspaper. The Sunday Times is distributed in Ireland, but it's a British newspaper. It's published in London. And that shows that the impact of the TPNW is having an impact internationally in the media, and it's having an impact in terms of being picked up in nuclear weapon states like the UK. And I think that's the possibilities that shows for our campaigning, for the impact that that will have in terms of the ban treaty taking further effect. That shows a lot of hope for the future in terms of hitting nuclear weapons where it really hurts in terms of their financing. And I think that shows a lot of hope that we can see both states like Ireland and pension funds and other funds which invest in international markets looking at nuclear weapons and saying, this isn't an option anymore. Nuclear weapons are a thing of the past. That's not where we need to put our money for the future. And I think the precedent that is set there by Ireland and by other countries in terms of the interpretation of the ban treaty, and particularly the assistance clause in the ban treaty to say that assistance includes financial investments in nuclear weapons companies, that's going to be important for the future as well, because it's clarifying where that map of the ban treaty is going into the future. So I see all sorts of exciting hopes and possibilities there as we look not just back at the last 4 years and everything that's been achieved by the agreement of the treaty and the gradual ratification by different countries reaching up to 50 and the entry into force earlier this year, but also where we can go in the future and where the ban treaty can take us in terms of all those steps towards a nuclear weapons free world. And I think I'll stop there and hand you back to Lynn.
Thank you so much, David. And Irish C&D in Ireland are always a bit of an inspiration for us in Scotland. So thank you so much. Thank you. So we're now turning to Aisha Asukan. Aisha, thank you so much for being here. Thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting me to this meeting and to take part in this celebration with you all. I do not have direct experience working on the TPNW as many of the other panelists have. I came after I started working on the TPNW after the TPNW came into force. But one of the main reasons why I was very much interested working for the nuclear weapon issues is because during my 7 years of experience in armed conflict countries, I've seen how conflict affects or armed conflict affects human beings. But one difference between the nuclear weapon and the conventional weapon is that immediately after an armed conflict, use of a conventional weapon, as humanitarians, we were able to respond to that crisis. But in the event of a nuclear weapon war, we will not be able to respond to that. We will not be able to respond to the crisis. So that, kind of inspired me to start working on the nuclear weapon issues. Now, coming to the TPNW, how is it different from the other treaties? First of all, the treaty changes the global conversation about the nuclear weapon and about the whole theory of nuclear deterrence. It significantly weakens the argument for maintaining these nuclear weapons. As said by David, it also forces the companies to divest, or it forces them to move away from divesting in the nuclear weapon. Now, as you know, like many of the countries, like the 9 nuclear weapon countries are not UN signatory to the treaty. So how can we kind of get them sign this TPNW? That's especially the US. There's a lot of challenges in the US where I work and many other organizations have been working on. We have been trying to influence both publicly and politically by getting the political support for the TPNW. So that's what it's a big challenge, and we have been trying to do that one. So I think I'll stop it there and hear more from Tillman.
Thank you, Isha. Okay, Tillman, thank you very much for getting up in the middle of the night. I think that's so kind of you. I'll be very impressed if you manage to string a sentence together, which I know you'll do better than. So please.
Well, thanks very much, Lynn, and thanks for the invitation. There's a few people around the place that you can't say no to, and Janet's one of them. It's only 4 o'clock in the morning. I first want to acknowledge that I speak to you from the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation in Naarm, as they knew Melbourne. Pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and thank them for their continuing custodianship of this place from which we all benefit, all of us more recent immigrants. I'm really excited to join you. I've only been to Scotland once, but it's a wonderful place and somewhere I'd love to come back to. I really thank you for the opportunity to join this celebration and pay tribute and renew our commitment to using this extraordinarily powerful tool that civil society, international organisations and especially governments that kind of get this and are frustrated by the continuing obfuscation and delays and failures of disarmament, did what they could to try and break that terrible logjam by banning the weapons. Of course, they can't eliminate weapons they don't own, unfortunately, but that's our job to use this tool now, this extraordinary tool that we have. I just want to pick out a couple of highlights. There's an awful lot that one could say, but at an occasion like this, there's a few people who need to be acknowledged. And the whole idea of ICAN came from the remarkable Dr. Ron McCoy, a Malaysian obstetrician. And it was in 2005, after the NPT review conference, hundreds of diplomats for a whole month at God knows what cost could agree nothing on nuclear disarmament, and even if they had, it probably wouldn't have made much difference, as the agreement solemnly ignored from 5 years previously had shown. But it should have been a wake-up call. 3 months after that was the World Summit. It was the largest meeting of heads of state that had ever been held to that date. And we were all hoping that after the wake-up call of the failed review conference, something would happen. Not a single line or sentence about disarmament, nuclear weapons was agreed. So it was I think a real wake-up call for a lot of people that business as usual was badly broken, and we needed some kind of new approach. And the new approach, the obvious lesson, was the extraordinary inspiration not that many years before of the international campaign to ban landmines, working with initially just the Lloyd Axworthy and the Canadian government, and then others, Austria, Ireland, Norway, came on board, not the largest or most powerful states. And crucially, despite the opposition of the major users and producers and the largest and most powerful states, US, Russia, China, that treaty was able to be concluded and has changed the game. So there was an obvious lesson there, and the lesson of history, if you look at every indiscriminate, inhumane weapon, or indeed any weapon that we've been able to make substantial progress on controlling, fundamental to that progress, essential to it, has been codifying in international law a rejection of these weapons as beyond the pale for all nations. However they're used, they can only be indiscriminate and inhumane. That then provides the basis and motivation for the progressive efforts to eliminate the weapons. It was simply applying the lessons of history. And Ron challenged a number of us, especially through IPPNW, we need an international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons. And a few of us thought, that's a pretty good idea. We can help with that. And I think some of the principles that we decided on then, with some very strong help from Felicity, then Hill, now Ruby, working for WILPF, who was the first staff person for ICANN, and others agreed on a set of sort of principles for ICANN that I think have stood the campaign in really good stead, and I think can continue to do so. It needs to be a campaign coalition around a really sharp, focused goal. It needs to not reinvent the wheel of all the wonderful organisations that work on these issues. It needs to bring them together to sing from the same hymn sheet in a coordinated way. It needs to be global. It needs to involve young people. It needs to be rooted in what the weapons do, as Janet has said, and not the arcane abstractions about deterrence and parity and balance and abstract mythology. And it needs to link the science and the evidence with the voices of survivors, with the voices of those who've lived under a mushroom cloud, who know that this is not a great power chess game. This is indiscriminate destruction wrought upon generations, with dispossession and ill health and death over, across generations. And I think one of the things I'm most proud of with ICANN is the bringing to the fore and really giving power to those voices of the survivors from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, as well as the nuclear test survivors from around the world. And I'm really proud of that. It was they, more than anything else, that cut through in New York during those negotiations, that constantly reminded the diplomats of why their work was and why this was not a political or nation state game. And you could hear a pin drop when Auntie Sue Common, Hassildine, Setsuko Thurlow, Karina Lester, Ronald Oldham, others spoke in the room. The other thing I think is really, or one other aspect of this treaty that I think is absolutely wonderful, is the way that it was negotiated. And there was criticism for ICANN at the time that you don't have a plan B. We all hoped that after the Vienna Humanitarian Conference that South Africa would step up and host the next conference, and that it wouldn't be an evidence-based review, that it would be a negotiating meeting. And when that didn't happen, ICANN didn't have a definite plan. And that was seen by some as a weakness at the time. But I think it turned out to be a real strength, because one of the worst things we could have done is to fix on an idea that then failed and perhaps even distracted from other opportunities. The fact that this happened through the United Nations and the most inclusive and authoritative political, legal, and moral source of authority in the United Nations, the General Assembly, was masterful, using the General Assembly effectively, where the veto and that applies in the Security Council, and the requirement for consensus, which is a recipe for rock bottom lowest common denominator or no agreement, that paralyzes the NPT and the CD. The General Assembly could decide on substantive matters by 2/3 majority if agreement wasn't possible. So this could not be blocked. And this was extraordinary. A new, complex, magnificent international treaty addressing the most acute existential threat that humanity faces. The first specific legal prohibition on nuclear weapons was negotiated basically over a time frame of 7 months and 4 months of actual negotiations. It was extraordinary, the level of commitment and efficiency that saw this through. Because if this hadn't been negotiated by the 7th of July 2017, that UN mandate would have inspired, and we would have been turned into pumpkins and back to the drawing board, seeking a new mandate. So, and the historic significance of that treaty, of course, was, and it's worth bringing out today, was recognised in the blessing of our dear friend Alfred, this is wonderful recognition of the historic importance of this treaty. And I just want to finish with saying the thing that gives me the most comfort that this treaty matters is the consistent level of opposition and dismay and really fierce pressure that it has aroused amongst the states that possess the weapons, that claim some unique right to threaten us all. if this treaty didn't matter, if this was some other piece of UN verbiage that they could happily pay lip service to but basically ignore, I'd be worried. But the fact that they've opposed this, put shameful pressure on some poor and on governments, and continue to do so. The reasons that they've acknowledged privately about why they oppose this treaty, that it challenges their essentially the fundamental possession of nuclear weapons and the policy of nuclear deterrence, gives me great comfort that this treaty matters. Let's use it well to finish the job. Thank you.
Thank you, Tillman. Thank you. Thank you so much. So the panelists that you've just heard may well have questions for each other, and you are also invited to write comments or questions in the chat. But let me just check whether any of them wishes to ask any of the rest of them, or any one of them, something, whether they know each other a little, some better than others, but let's see if they want to pick up old stories or start new ones between themselves just for a second.
I'm very happy to defer to the collective group. My brain isn't as crisp as it might be at this hour.
That's absolutely fair enough. I think David has told us some very optimistic things about change he's already seeing happening. I don't know, Aisha, whether you feel you're already seeing change happening as a consequence of the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons in the domains that you are inhabiting, or indeed, Janet, whether you wish to pick that up.
I would like to ask Asha if she can talk a little bit about some of the work that's been done at a parliamentary, the pledge, and the city's appeal in the US, because I think that's been hugely impactful, and given the very, very hard edge of the mainstream thinking in the US and their opposition, I know there's been great work done in undermining that and showing that to be in complete democratic deficit. But I couldn't give you any detail on that, but I think she might be able to. So that's a question for you, Asha.
Aisha, please.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, yeah, as Janet and everybody else have said, there is a lot of challenges in the US to, to get a positive to get positive approval or from the US government administration or from the public. As you know, as many, the two major arguments made by the US as well as the NATO is that the treaty does not reflect the contemporary security environment, and that it would undermine the NPT. But which is a wrong argument made by the US as well as in NATO, because the NPT is explicitly mentioned in the TPNW preamble, which reaffirms that to the full and the effective implementation of the NPT. So that is one of the arguments that the US has been making about the TPNW, along with the other NATO country. The major NATO countries. In the US, one of the arguments from a public perspective is that it's very difficult to get rid of this nuclear weapons in a multilateral treaties, and they don't trust the Russia I recently had an event, and one of the the audience was telling that we don't trust Russia. Russia is cheating with the number of nuclear weapons they have. So those are the kinds of arguments that is being made. So with respect to the positivity or the work that nuclearban.us and the many other organizations has been making is in order to get a positive response to the TPNW, it's very important that we build a political support and the public support. And the political support at all levels, whether it be at the city, or the town, the state, or the federal level. So we have been getting we have been engaging with the members of the Congress. As of now, 11 members of the Congress have signed the ICANN pledges. In addition to that one of the member of the Congress, Norton, Eleanor Holmes Norton, has introduced a bill which specifically calls on the US to sign and ratify the TPNW and take leadership in eliminating the nuclear weapon. So we have been working on that, getting that bill, using that bill as an opportunity to educate the members of the Congress and to get more support for the TPNW. It's the same case at the city and the state level as well. There are several resolutions being introduced and kind of pushing to get those passed in the state legislatures. On the other side is kind of putting pressure on the profiteers, who are the companies that have been investing on nuclear weapon. If you see the ICANN, the 2020 ICANN report, which came very recently, almost $72 billion is being spent by these 9 nuclear states, and the US is the first. It has spent almost, if I'm not wrong, 32 or 34 billion dollars on nuclear weapon. So along with getting political and public support, on the other side, we are also putting pressure on the companies that have been investing on that is investing on producing nuclear weapon. So those are the strategies that's being used, but I can definitely say that it's quite challenging. As Tillman, and Janet and David has all said, in the beginning it was very difficult. When you started the idea of TPNW, everybody said it is impossible to get a TPNW, right? And the same argument is going on, but it's not impossible, and we will definitely get this nuclear weapon countries also to sign the TPNW. So yeah, that's all from the work that's being done in the US.
Thank you, Aisha. We've got another couple of questions in the chat that I don't think everybody can see, but I think we'll just quickly try to deal with them, and then we'll probably move to the next part of our evening. So one is from Dagmar and one is from Daphne Wasserman. So I will read them out. So Dagmar says, should the next step for campaigners be to get more states to ratify, or for local legislation within states to use the treaty to change national local legislation? So you can maybe come back on that, although they're not, of course, mutually exclusive, and both are part of what we're trying to do. And then Daphne says, how can we respond to the UK government increase in warheads, which must go against the NPT as well as the TPNW? And I'm sure we've all got views about that. So let me just see whether, I don't think we need everybody in the panel to respond, but let's just see if anyone wishes to particularly chip in on one or both of those. Tillman.
Yeah, thanks. Just a couple of quick comments. I think it's certainly true that for every level of government, their first responsibility is to protect their citizens, and every level of government is involved in in services, in responsibilities that would be completely impossible following a nuclear war and dealing with the aftermath. So this, and cities are the targets, particularly where national governments fail to deliver on that responsibility. I think working with cities and states is a really useful strategy. But as you've said, Lynn, I don't think these things are mutually exclusive. It's really important for the force of the treaty that it accrue and continue to accrue states as signatories and states parties. We've had a little bit of a lull so far this year. There's obviously plenty of other preoccupations and COVID, etc. I hope there'll be a real flurry at the UN General Assembly and states that have to complete that ratification by mid-October if they want to be states parties, because the treaty enters into force for them 90 days after they ratify. So they have to ratify by, I forget the date, in October, if they want to be a state party at the scheduled MSP meeting of states parties at 12th to the 14th of January in Vienna. And a number of countries have said, Indonesia prominent among them, that they want to be there as a state party. But I think any way of engaging with this treaty, participation as observers is useful. Many think that it's more likely that there'll be movement amongst nuclear client states or nuclear dependent states, NATO allies, Japan, South Korea, Australia, than amongst nuclear armed states first. I don't know about that. I think many of us think that the UK, particularly pending developments in your fine land, could find itself in a situation where it's actually quite difficult and wants to make an exit, or is forced to make an exit from adding British nuclear weapons to US ones. It depends on political opportunities, changes of government, and we have to be really alive and flexible to those. So I think all of these things are important, and working with the governments that are already on board is crucial, to encourage them, to support them, to really actively make it part of their diplomacy and their national commitments to push the treaty, to raise it at every national, bilateral, regional, international meeting, to work with other states, because otherwise there's a real risk that particularly smaller and less powerful states and more aid and trade dependent states will get picked off. And there's already been, severe pressure from nuclear armed states, so we need to counter that. So I think it's horses for courses at different approaches of work in different places. Australia, in my context, is extremely isolated in the region. All of the countries of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations to our north, with the exception of Singapore, which caved in at the last moment and broke ASEAN solidarity in voting to adopt the treaty, all of the other 10 or 11 member states of ASEAN have signed or ratified the treaty, all support. In the Pacific Island countries who have borne the brunt of nuclear testing of France, the UK and the US, people get this. And it was 10 Pacific Island governments who contributed to that first 50 that got the treaty into force. They get this. New Zealand is a global leader. So Australia is extremely isolated, and using effective political lobbying and using parliamentary support, where we managed to get 3/4 of the Labor Party, the opposition party of government, to sign the parliamentary pledge, cross-factional, more than 2/3 of the shadow cabinet, and really good lobbying and advocacy was important in getting into the national platform of the Labor Party in 2018, reconfirmed earlier this year a commitment to sign and ratify the treaty when in government. So, the path between policy and action is not direct or automatic, and that needs continued pressure, but that's a really important start in Australia. And there's work to be done according to the political opportunities in every place, but the mix will be different in different places, and I think that's absolutely fine.
Thank you for that, Tillman. Thank you. And you alluded to the hope of opportunity that we have in Scotland if we become an independent country, and then the UK government would be forced to basically disarm, and the nuclear weapons would literally have nowhere to go. I don't know whether, Janet, you wanted to say anything else about that.
I think that I mean, we know that here that is the case, and obviously we seek support from our fellow disarmament campaigners around the world in understanding that and giving us the support we need towards that. And I know that we've had some success as far as that's concerned in working with some of the Irish parliamentarians and with our own cross-party group of Scottish parliamentarians. I'm really aware that there may be there may be other opportunities for Scottish parliamentarians, because given that they have a very strong position in opposition, most of them have signed the parliamentary pledge, and I know that we've got this new Friends of the TPNW as an international grouping, and I'd be keen to know whether there are ways that Tillman might suggest that we could connect our Scottish parliamentarians with the parliamentarians in Australia in a way that could be mutually effective. The other thing, though, is that I do feel that there may be opportunities for the Scottish government to take action now, rather than waiting until putting all our eggs in the basket of independence as being the point at which we could sign the treaty and make the difference. I think there's a great deal that we can do in terms of undermining the idea that nuclear weapons can be acceptable by passing legislation that would outlaw certain aspects of the structures that are required to have them in the first place. I think there are possibilities with education, for example, that school children should be educated to understand UN process, that universities should be limited in running courses that allow people to learn the technology that's required for nuclear weapons, or at least to understand what that means, that medical students should be educated to understand what the effects of nuclear weapons would be on a population. After all, we are a target in Scotland. I think there may be ways in which, even though we can't sign the treaty, we can identify where, as some of the states like Cuba and Palestine have done, where there are nuclear sites over which they have no control on their territory. I think we could ask parliamentarians to, in some way, highlight that. So, you know, these are just some of the things, and I don't know whether these are just crazy dreams of mine, or whether they are things that people in the, well, I'm asking Tillman and David if they think we could actually do that.
I'm sorry, we need to probably move on, Tillman. So could you maybe just respond incredibly briefly, because time is marching on and we have some other speakers to come.
Sure, thanks, Lynn. Look, very briefly, I think we should really work with parliamentarians. I mean, there's lots that can be done in every sector, and parliamentarians globally have some really good coordinating bodies, especially the Interparliamentary Union. They can also send observers to meetings, and we're strongly encouraging the Labor Party here to send an observer to the MSP, even if the government doesn't. So yeah, getting parliamentarians to use their voices is really crucial, and I think Janet's right. Scotland is in an extraordinarily important global position, and with or without independence, if you are able to push the UK to relinquish its arsenal or make it unsustainable for it to continue, that would be a hugely significant contribution that could really have massive flow-ons in lots of other places. Makes your work really important for all of us.
Thank you, Tillman. David, your name was mentioned. Do you want to just very briefly say something too?
If you don't, I agree entirely with what Tillman and Janet were both talking about and aspiring towards then. And I don't think there's such a thing as crazy dreams when it comes to working towards nuclear disarmament. Those are the dreams that we follow and chase, and we bring them true. If you like, Lynn, I just spotted another question in the chat which was directed at me from the Irish context from Michael. If you'd like me to address that one very quickly, it was about Ireland's position on the UN Security Council, and can we use that to advocate for the treaty? I think the answer is yes, but we're kind of stymied by the structures of the UN Security Council and the fact that the nuclear armed states heavily outweigh a country like Ireland within the UN Security Council. So when I spoke to the Irish diplomats at the UN about this, they said, when nuclear disarmament comes up, then obviously we're going to stand up for Ireland's position, which is that we support the TPNW and that it strengthens the NPT, and that's the route we should be going down. And they said, like, Ireland and Mexico will take that line. Unfortunately, we're up against the 5 permanent members plus India at the moment, so we wouldn't see it as a particularly productive route to be going down in terms of pushing nuclear disarmament at the UN. And the General Assembly and First Committee would be the routes at the UN that Ireland would prefer to use there. I think I'm representing the Irish position reasonably accurately with that answer. Obviously, I'm not speaking on behalf of the Irish government there, but I think that's the Irish position.
Thank you very much for that. Thank you. And thanks to Michael Orgel for the question. Thank you both. So I'm now going to invite Jolene Pretorius and Tony Hastrup to make contributions, and they're both speaking about the perspective of African states. I think African states' contribution to the international context is often neglected generally, but their contribution to changing the discourse and helping to shift us towards a much more humanitarian focus is perhaps being particularly neglected in the context of the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. It's not something that people here in the UK know very much about. And so we thought we would invite them to briefly talk about aspects of this from their knowledge of it. They're both academics. Jolene is an associate professor in political studies at the University of the Western Cape in South Africa, and also a member of the South African branch of Pugwash. And Tony is a senior lecturer in international politics here in Scotland in the University of Stirling. So I'm just now turning to Jolene's contribution. And I'll also just remind you that South Africa is really the only state that actually gave up nuclear weapons. And so that's another reason for being particularly keen to hear from their perspective.
Jolene has provided us with a video, but I can see that she's also here in person, and I don't know whether she would prefer the opportunity to address us directly.
Which would you prefer, Jolene? You just say.
Well, if you can hear me, I'll speak to it. My son is still up, so we might have some noises in the background. Okay, so how far we have come, the African side of the story. That's what I titled my presentation. In the 1960s, France tested more than 16 nuclear bombs in Algeria in what I call a grotesque act. And I quote it, and I use the term of Ghana's first post-independence president, Kwame Nkrumah. He termed this nuclear imperialism. The test had devastating consequences for local communities at these sites and neighboring countries that experienced the nuclear fallout. Several African states had their own plans for nuclear weapons: Egypt, Nigeria, Libya, but only one went through with it, and that was apartheid South Africa, that wanted to use the bomb to blackmail Western states into helping them sustain a racist regime. So how far have we come in Africa? In 1990, South Africa dismantled its nuclear weapons as one of the first acts to end apartheid. And in 2003, Libya ended its clandestine program. In 1996, the Pelindaba Treaty was adopted, and it entered into force in 2009, making Africa, and in conjunction with other treaties, the whole Southern Hemisphere nuclear weapon-free zone. The Pelindaba Treaty expressed the official African approach of abolition. But for Africans, abolition of nuclear weapons is not just a continental affair under the norm of non-proliferation, as nuclear armed states would label it. It has always been a global affair. For example, in 1962, Kwame Nkrumah organized an assembly in Ghana under the theme, "A World Without the Bomb." And this theme reverberates through African efforts in the NPT and also in its support of the Ban Treaty. The TPNW ends nuclear imperialism for Africans in two ways. Firstly, it entitles those communities affected by nuclear testing to reparations. And secondly, it installs nuclear equality. Nuclear weapons are illegal for all and not just for some. And by this equality, I can also add that it adds equality in terms of the forum. The NPT is so one-sided, it's so biased. The conversations that happens there is so loaded, whereas in the TPNW, the process just seems to be much more democratized. The TPNW therefore codifies the norm against nuclear weapons in international law that will become stronger over time. And the delegitimizing effect of this treaty, I think we should not underestimate. After the first nuclear test in the Sahara, President de Gaulle honored the general responsible, sending him a note saying, "Hooray for France. This morning she is stronger and prouder. From the bottom of my heart, I thank you and those who have achieved this magnificent success." I argue, just as the Kellogg-Briand Pact that outlawed wars of aggression was used in the Nuremberg and Tokyo trials, that one day the Ban Treaty will be holding those who make decisions and work for nuclear weapons to account. And this is a deterrent effect. We have to send this message out to people who are for nuclear weapons, whether they're academics, whether they're engineers, whether they're politicians. In the future, you will be shamed. You will stand trial. You will have to pay. You will not receive a Medal of Honor. You will not be a hero. Thank you.
Thank you. And now Tony Hastrup, would you like to speak to us, please?
Absolutely. Thank you so much again for inviting me. I should say that, you know, my entry point into looking at nuclear issues in Africa has come from a bit of a historical reflection that draws on sort of post-colonial and decolonial, as well as feminist reflections on global power hierarchies, of which when we're looking at security issues, nuclear weaponry is just one of those. And from that perspective, I've been thinking quite a bit, sort of as a leap off of some of what Julian was saying, but also thinking through how, you know, African activism at the UN and its strategic positioning as the nuclear-free zone can only tell a part of the story of the African experience of nuclear weapons, right? And I think that it's fair to say that, you know, nuclear technology everywhere really has developed through colonial practices of extraction, testing, desecration of indigenous land, and of course, these horrific crimes. And I think it's in this context that testing, particularly when you look at French testing in Algeria, has taken place. In the sort of feminist discourse or perspective that I tend to come from, we tend to feel like it's still the case that the discourse around nuclear weapons has a tendency to sanitize the lethality of these weapons. Yet the reality is that, when we particularly look at testing, because often part of why that sanitation takes place is because we look at what happened in Japan and we put it as history, and we're very comfortable saying never again without really thinking about the impact of the other impact of testing and the fallout from that in years on. And indeed, one of the reasons why I was particularly interested in France is because, on the one hand, in the last sort of 18 months, France has declared a feminist foreign policy. And in parallel to that, has renewed a commitment to modernizing its nuclear arsenal. And I've been really interested in the discourses of the French establishment, its president, minister of defense, around how it justifies this while making claims to a feminist foreign policy that in theory would be one that seeks to reorient existing global power hierarchies, particularly those between France and its former colonies, which are mostly in the global south. And so when we sort of take a brief step back, we know that France tested in Algeria, but not just in Algeria, in French Polynesia up until relatively recently. And the only reason why France shifts away from Algeria is because it comes at the end of the agreement it made with the Algerians to leave Algeria. And now I find this really interesting because French leaving, so France no longer being a colonial power, was contingent on testing nuclear weapons in Algeria. And I think that history is not spoken about a lot, particularly again when more recent French leadership has been very dismissive of claims around colonialism and the persistence of colonialism in the relationship with the former colonies. So to quote one source talking about the impact of testing in Algeria, they say in Algeria, testing sites are still contaminated. Activists say many fenced off by only barbed wire at best. And a French physicist says, I saw radiation levels emitted from mineral rocks vitrified by the bomb's heat, which are colossal. And to date, then, France has not really dealt with the human costs of this testing. In 2010, there was a law passed in France that allowed for military veterans as well as civilians to claim compensation for the effects of nuclear programs. We know that relatively few people have been compensated, and when they are compensated, it tends to be people who are citizens of France, based in France. So again, no compensation for the Algerians. And I've argued that, in the way that France is going about this, we're going to hold on to our nuclear weapons, and it's part of a modern security, whatever that means. France really sees itself as a masculinist protector of security in Europe. And for me, this is really interesting as someone who's just moved back to Scotland, where there's a lot of talk around independence. There's a substantive rejection of this idea of nuclear weapons being, any sort of security guarantor. And as someone who studies France foreign policy to an extent, it's very strange that majority of the threats that France articulates as being security issues cannot be combated at all by nuclear weapons. So I think it's quite interesting that this discourse is being used to facilitate the retention of this really lethal, horrific type of weapon. So to my mind then, what nuclear retention facilitates for France, and indeed, I think, you know, I haven't looked at so many other countries, but when you hear the discourse around nuclear weapons from the UK government, is that it facilitates the persistence of a coloniality of power, meaning sort of colonial logics within the realm of international politics more broadly. And so for me, for example, it is not surprising that this is a narrative that is being pursued in the UK, really ramped up after Brexit, and one might think, well, this doesn't really make sense, but actually it makes a lot of sense. But part of why I'm particularly interested, particularly in the African dimension, is and with respect to France, is that those compensations are not being given back. And I'm sort of urging those who are invested in just having a wind up nuclear weapons completely to not think of this as compensations, but as reparations. Not just reparations for the harms that have been done with respect to nuclear weapons, but how this is an ongoing harm. This is not in the past in terms of, well, it's just post-1960s, but for us to really think about how we support activists, but also ordinary people, so that the discourse around nuclear weapons is not just about what states do at the UN Security Council. Thank you.
Thank you very much to you both. Thank you, Tony. And everything that you've said about France, I think, is just as applicable to the United Kingdom in its own way. So thank you for that. Okay, so that part of our discussion is finished, but what we now wish to do is to show you a video which uses the words of the treaty and also has some other contributions, international contributions from people who couldn't be here today. But I want to again thank everybody who's contributed, both by speaking in person and in the case of Bill also on video, and to you who posted chat comments and questions. Thank you very much for that.
Around the year 2010, a small group of states, diplomats, academic experts, civil society experts began to devise how to reframe the discourse on nuclear weapons to focus on the humanitarian dimension, the humanitarian impact of these weapons, of explosions, and of the risks that are associated with these weapons. And this humanitarian focus had some very important consequences, because when you really look at the impact of these weapons, the humanitarian and other consequences, you see that they are much graver and they're more complex and they're more widespread than was previously assumed. And similarly, looking at the many risks associated with this weapon, that something happens either intentionally or unintentionally through any form of accident, you also see that these risks are much graver and more complex than previously understood. We don't know exactly the probability about these risks, but we know that the risks are very high because the consequences are so grave. And we know that in the past, on several occasions, humanity came very close to the brink and was just simply lucky that nothing happened. So this combined look at the humanitarian consequences and risks of nuclear weapons, it changes the discussion about abstract concepts of nuclear deterrence, and it changes the discussion into a very concrete and tangible discussion about the concrete threat to all humanity. And most of all, it changes the discussion into a direction that nuclear weapon states don't want to go to, because the human security, it's a human security focus. It counters the nuclear weapon states narrative on security, on responsibility, and on the legitimacy of the nuclear status quo.
of imperialism, yeah, it's related, of course, to the history of nuclear weapon testing, which has happened primarily on indigenous land. The US tested on indigenous land in Nevada, on the land of the Western Shoshone, which is actually known as the most bombed nation on Earth. And it also tested in the Pacific. The French tested in the Pacific and in Algeria, when Algeria was a colony. The British tested in Australia on indigenous land. The Russians tested on Kazakhstan. So the list just goes on and on and on of how the nuclear armed states have tested their bombs on people that they decided that didn't have an equal humanity, on land that they decided was empty, even though it was not at all empty and was populated by indigenous groups, and with very little care to the populations and the environment. And so those are two of the main connections there. And so work that we do against imperialism and capitalism, and work that we do from a post-colonial perspective, and from an anti-capitalist perspective, can very much, the nuclear abolition movement, I believe, can gain from connecting with these movements, because it is all bound up together historically, but also in terms of how these harms are still being carried out today, the effects that are still being felt today in all of these places, and how we value each other and what we see as justice moving forward from here.
People one generation ahead of me feel strongly connected to the issue. It shows that not only that generation is really committed to nuclear disarmament. In the recent opinion polls that we conducted together with ICANN, it shows that 80% of the Dutch population really would like the Netherlands to join the recent ban on nuclear weapons. The 68% of our population thinks that the Netherlands should be the first one to get rid of nuclear weapons within NATO. And they would also like to get rid of those American weapons based in Volkel. The recent ICANN report quite clearly shows that there is huge popular support within NATO countries for nuclear disarmament, for joining the ban. There's a big support from a lot of cities within Europe. There's a lot of MPs that are supportive of this case.
Ireland has very much emphasised the importance of the TPNW as something which complements and completes the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And I want to quote very briefly the Irish Foreign Minister speaking last year in 2019 before the TPNW had reached its 50 ratifications. Speaking at the conference in Geneva, he said, "We must also be creative and original in our approach to achieving our shared goal of a world without nuclear weapons and not be limited by traditional one-dimensional thinking. The Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons offers us a path to nuclear disarmament by finally putting in place a workable legal framework for the total elimination of nuclear weapons. The treaty is fully complementary with the NPT. The TPNW strengthens and reinforces the NPT and reaffirms it as the cornerstone of the disarmament and non-proliferation regime. It is a facilitator, not an impediment to progress. As recognised in the NPT, TPNW and throughout the discussions on the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons, the only true guarantee against the horrors of nuclear weapons is the total elimination of nuclear weapons."
The Benn Treaty gives hope to civil society from around the world because campaigners from around the world, civil society, came up together and in solidarity managed to achieve something that seemed it's almost impossible, a Benn Treaty. Now that we have the Benn Treaty, it's time to really celebrate. And then it's time to work hard together in solidarity again, just like we know, in order to get the 9 nuclear armed states into the table, into the ban. It is very much achievable. My name is Sharon Dolev. I'm from the Middle East Treaty Organization and from ICANN in Israel, the Israel Disarmament Movement. And I wish us all good luck.
Here in Brazil and in entire Latin America and Caribbean, we already have our own scope of prohibitions, as we have the first nuclear weapon-free zone in a populated area. Even with this extensive scope of bans, we must expand the same safe feeling to other regions. The PNW not just reinforces all the prohibitions we already have, but also promotes this need globally, as the impacts of a detonation, by intention or not, in other regions will hurt here too. There is only one planet. We are all in the same boat. In the lack of a captain in the ship of international community, we must call and put pressure on all states to eliminate weapons of mass destruction, as such nuclear weapons. As immoral as they are, soon it will become illegal as customary law. And then even those states that hide their international responsibilities in silly arguments will have to follow TPNW's obligations. Thank you.
Between 1946 and 1958, the US government detonated 67 thermonuclear atmospheric tests in the Marshall Islands. The scale of these 67 tests in the Marshall Islands is equivalent to a detonation of 1.7 Hiroshima bombs every day for 12 years. The March 1, 1954 Bravo test was also the most powerful nuclear device ever detonated by the United States, which at 15 megatons was 1,000 times the force of the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1944. This test rained heavy fallout on nearby inhabited atolls and ushered in a new era of radiation-related studies on humans, the trauma of which continues to be felt today in the Marshall Islands. The United States government's decision to proceed with the Bravo test, despite knowing that the winds would carry the fallout to nearby inhabited islands, represents a deep sadness in our nuclear legacy story, matched only by the sadness of the forced displacement of the Bikini and Eniwetok people from their island homes to accommodate the other test sites. The promise of a temporary displacement would turn into one that persists today for the people of Bikini and Rongelap atolls, whose homelands remain unsafe and too dangerous for their return. As a result, these communities have been forced to connect to new lands, not of their own, and learn new ways to adapt and survive. Cumulative long-term impacts on our health and environment are well studied, but too many uncertainties still exist, including the impacts of radiation exposure on future generations. Cancer rates are abnormally high among Marshallese people, and illnesses that were never known prior to the testing period are now prevalent throughout the islands.
Hi, my name is Maria Pia. I am really happy to participate in this birthday event from Buenos Aires, Argentina. I am a member of the Human Security Network in Latin America and the Caribbean region, CELAC. And for us, the Nuclear Ban Treaty is the fundamental cornerstone of our peaceful society. Latin America and the Caribbean region was the first region in the world to ban nuclear weapons in the late 60s. And there is a very popular comic strip from that time from Argentina, but known worldwide, that is called Mafalda. It's a little girl with political and social views, and reflect, because there was a huge debate around nuclear weapons because of the Cuba missiles crisis, and there's a lot of them, but I want to show you one of my favorites. Today, that is real, and we are celebrating Nuclear Ban Treaty anniversary. So, cheers.